April 1867. Rural Ohio. Mist clings to the fields as dawn breaks over a quiet farming town. Church bells ring faintly in the distance, calling families to prayer, yet whispers rise louder than hymns. In a modest wooden farmhouse, neighbors gather at the fence, speaking of a child unlike any they have ever known. His silence unsettles, his strength defies reason, and his gaze lingers like a question no one dares answer. Some call him a blessing, others a curse. All agree on one thing: this is the boy science could not explain. Ohio, 1867. The war is over, but its echo has not faded. Fields that once sent men to battle now grow corn and wheat again. Steam trains whistle across new iron tracks, stitching small towns together with the sound of progress. On Sundays, church bells still call families from miles away, reminding them of order and tradition. Yet behind the hum of rural life, there lingers a sense of unease, a nation rebuilt but not healed. In this world, medicine is still a fragile science. Doctors rely on ledgers, scalpels, and theories more than certainty. A cough can mean a week in bed, or it can mean a grave. Remedies are passed down from mothers to daughters, mixtures of herbs, prayers, and hope. The word anatomy feels foreign to many farmers, yet they know their land and their families with an intimacy that textbooks cannot replace. In barns and kitchens, illness is whispered about with the same fear as storms or crop failure. The people of Ohio live in a delicate balance between what they can explain and what they cannot. When someone recovers from sickness against all odds, they call it God's mercy. When someone wastes away without reason, they call it God's will. Yet a few voices, professors in distant cities, lecturers who travel by train, argue that science might hold the answers. These voices reach even the quietest towns, where newspapers and pamphlets pass from hand to hand. But progress is uneven. What is known in New York or Boston takes years to arrive in the farmlands of Ohio. This is a place where stories matter as much as facts. A neighbor's tale told by lamplight can spread faster than any printed sheet. The line between truth and folklore blurs, especially in communities shaped by fear, faith, and memory of war. People still recall omens seen on battlefields, strange lights in the sky before victory or loss, dreams that seem to predict death. To them, a child who does not follow nature's rules could be a sign of blessing or of curse. The countryside itself feels like a stage for mystery. Dense woods edge the fields, their branches casting long shadows even at midday. Dirt roads vanish into fog, leaving travelers disoriented. Winter can be harsh, isolating families for weeks, while summer heat brings fevers no doctor can cure. Life is hard, but it is ordered: birth, work, prayer, and death. To step outside that order is to invite whispers. And it is into this world, half modern, half ancient, that the story of Timothy Caldwell begins. A boy born to a farming family, whose presence unsettled neighbors and confounded physicians. In 1867, amid the ordinary rhythms of Ohio life, one child would become the subject of hushed conversations, doubtful diagnoses, and newspaper columns that could never fully explain him. For now the year is set. The fields are green, the bells ring, and the trains whistle. Yet behind the calm surface lies a mystery waiting to be told, the story of a boy science could not explain. The Caldwell family lived in a modest farmhouse set against rolling fields in rural Ohio. Their lives, like those of many neighbors, followed the rhythm of the seasons: planting, tending, and harvesting. Timothy Caldwell, the father, was known in town as steady and hardworking, a man who measured his words carefully and kept his ledger balanced with equal discipline. His wife, Mary, ran the household with quiet strength, raising their children with a mix of faith and practical knowledge learned from her mother. They were not wealthy, but neither were they poor. Their table was seldom empty, and their fields, though modest, yielded enough to sustain them. The family belonged to the local church, where Sundays meant polished boots, hymns rising into wooden rafters, and fellowship with other farming families. In every way, the Caldwells were ordinary, until the whispers about their youngest son began to set them apart. Within the household, the boy's early years were marked by a mixture of love and concern. He was not sickly, yet something about him unsettled those who saw him. Neighbors described him in ways that did not fit the usual language of childhood: too quiet when others played, too alert when others rested, too strong in moments when he should have been fragile. Mary wrote, or so local lore suggests, that she both adored and feared the child, holding him close at night yet watching for signs she could not name. Timothy, more practical, dismissed gossip but could not dismiss what his eyes saw: a boy who seemed to live by rules unfamiliar to both farm and faith. For the Caldwells, Life became a daily balance between keeping their son safe and shielding him from the community's curiosity. In time, their farmhouse became a point of fascination for the surrounding county. Farmers paused at the fence line longer than courtesy allowed. Women whispered at the well, speculating on the nature of the child who was not like others. Visitors came under the guise of trading seeds or offering bread, but their eyes drifted always toward the small figure in the yard. Inside the home, the family carried on as best they could, but the pressure mounted. Mary's prayers grew longer, Timothy's temper shorter, and the boy himself seemed caught in a world that both embraced and rejected him. Census records list the Caldwells as one of many farming families of the time, yet the details of their private struggle remain clouded. What is remembered is less the grain they harvested or the livestock they kept, and more the aura that surrounded their child, a presence that would soon draw doctors, neighbors, and strangers alike to the farmhouse door. The first signs that something about the Caldwell boy was unusual emerged quietly, like ripples across still water. In a small town where every child was known, his differences did not go unnoticed for long. Neighbors whispered that he seemed older than his years, carrying himself with a stillness that felt unnatural for a child. While others chased dogs or wrestled in the fields, he often stood apart, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. His silence unnerved visitors who expected the noise and laughter of youth. Even the way he moved, steady, deliberate, measured, left an impression that seemed out of place in a world defined by play. Soon, conversations at the churchyard and marketplace circled back to the same question. What was wrong with the Caldwell boy? The family at first treated these murmurs as nothing more than gossip. Timothy carried on with his work, telling himself that country folk had long memories and loose tongues. Mary tried to shield her son, keeping him close when neighbors visited, guiding him gently into conversations to prove he was no different from any other child. Yet the differences could not always be hidden. His strength startled those who witnessed it, lifting more than a boy his size should or enduring tasks with a stamina unexpected in one so young. His gaze, too, was unsettling, calm, unwavering, as though he understood things never spoken aloud. Some whispered of God's blessing, others of an omen, but all agreed that there was something in him that defied explanation. As months passed, the murmurs grew louder, and what began as curiosity hardened into unease. Children teased him at the edge of the schoolyard, daring one another to stand near him too long. Adults grew cautious, their questions sharp, their visits briefer than before. For the Caldwells, the farmhouse became both a refuge and a prison, a place where love for their son mingled with the fear of what others believed. Timothy's patience began to crack as neighbors offered suggestions couched as warnings. Call a doctor, consult the preacher, keep the boy hidden. Mary prayed more fervently, uncertain whether she sought answers from heaven or protection from her neighbors. The boy himself remained quiet, watching, listening, carrying his difference like a shadow. By late 1867, his story was no longer confined to the fence lines of Ohio farmland. It was moving beyond, gathering the weight of rumor that would soon reach the pages of local newspapers and the notice of men who called themselves scientists. When the whispers about the Caldwell boy reached beyond the fence lines, the first to respond was the local physician, a man more familiar with broken bones and fevers than with mysteries of the human body. He arrived with a worn leather bag and a cautious expression, as though he expected to find nothing unusual at all. Inside the farmhouse, he examined the child in the dim light of an oil lamp, listening to his breathing, feeling his pulse, testing his strength with simple instructions. To every outward measure, the boy appeared healthy, his heartbeat steady, his frame strong, his lungs clear. Yet the physician could not reconcile what he observed with what the neighbors described. The unusual stamina, the unsettling stillness, the way his eyes seemed to follow more than what was in the room. He closed his bag, offered the family a few words of reassurance, and walked away more puzzled than when he arrived. But the questions did not stop with one man's uncertainty. Word spread quickly to towns farther away, carried by farmers at market and ministers visiting other parishes. Soon, the Caldwells were hosting visitors not only from their own county but from neighboring ones, each curious to see the boy for themselves. Among them were doctors who claimed more experience, some traveling by carriage from cities where universities had begun to collect specimens and write journals. These men brought with them not only sharper instruments but sharper skepticism. They pressed the child with questions, tapped his joints, peered into his eyes with the tools of their trade. Yet their notes were inconclusive. One suggested it was a nervous disorder, another hinted at heredity, still another avoided committing to any explanation at all. Each left with the same outcome: A case that unsettled their training that could not be easily categorized in the growing catalogs of science. For the Caldwell family, these visits brought little comfort. Each examination meant disruption, expense, and a renewed wave of whispers from the community. Strangers arrived at their door, scribbling in notebooks, sketching the boy's face and leaving with furrowed brows. Mary felt the weight of their gazes linger long after they were gone, while Timothy resented the intrusion but endured it, believing answers might protect his son from further suspicion. Yet the more doctors came, the less certain the answers became, and the more the story of the boy grew into something larger than the family itself. By autumn of 1867, the case was no longer just a curiosity of neighbors. It had become an unsolved riddle for science, carried on slips of paper in medical ledgers and whispered about in halls where men debated the limits of their own understanding. The town around the Caldwells was small enough that nothing remained private for long, and the story of the boy began to take on a life of its own. At the churchyard, his name was whispered between hymns, parents lowering their voices as children listened with wide eyes. In the market square, neighbors traded not only grain and livestock but rumors, each telling of something strange they claimed to have seen. A boy who did not tire after hours of labor, a child who seemed to hear conversations from across the yard, a gaze that unsettled even the most practical farmer. With each retelling, the details stretched, shaping him into something half real, half legend. Some spoke of divine favor, a child sent as a sign of blessing, while others muttered of curses carried through generations. The Caldwells, once regarded simply as a hard-working family, now carried an invisible mark that set them apart from the rest of the town. As fear mingled with fascination, the community began to divide. A few neighbors tried to offer comfort, leaving food or kind words, hoping to show the Caldwells they were not alone. But many others kept their distance. Children were told not to play near the farmhouse, their parents anxious about what might follow them home. Invitations to gatherings grew fewer, glances at church grew longer, and silence spread where once there had been easy conversation. Ministers gave sermons that, without naming names, warned against signs and wonders that might lead the faithful astray. For Mary, the shift was painful, each absence at her doorstep another reminder of how far her family had drifted from acceptance. For Timothy, it stirred anger, his pride wounded by the judgment of men he had once worked beside in the fields. Yet the boy himself seemed untouched by the swirl of opinion around him. He walked the yard with the same deliberate steps, his expression unreadable, his silence steady even as whispers reached his ears. If he noticed the stares of strangers, he gave no sign. If he felt the distance from neighbors, he did not show it. The mystery of his difference deepened as the town's responses grew sharper. Fascination becoming rumor, rumor becoming suspicion, and suspicion threatening to become something harsher. What had begun as curiosity now edged toward fear, and fear, in small towns bound by faith and folklore, was often the spark that lit stories into legends. By the end of 1867, the Caldwells stood not only as a family but as a symbol, for some, of wonder beyond explanation, for others, of danger better left unspoken. By the winter of 1867, the story of the Caldwell boy had traveled farther than the farm roads of Ohio. Doctors in nearby towns had already failed to provide answers, but their vague notes and reluctant testimonies only fed the curiosity of others. Physicians from larger cities, some connected to medical societies, began to arrive with an air of authority, carrying polished instruments in leather cases and quoting texts from European journals. They promised certainty, but what they found was something that defied their categories. They measured the boy's height, tested his reflexes, even compared his growth against other children of his age. He passed each test as though ordinary, yet his presence unsettled them. It was not one symptom but the total impression: a body too strong, a gaze too knowing, a silence that carried weight. Their reports, when written, were cautious, using phrases like unverified, unusual, or not yet explained. The arrival of these outsiders transformed the boy from a local curiosity into an object of professional debate. Letters were exchanged between doctors, some preserved in fragments, others lost to time, hinting at heated arguments over whether his condition was natural or unnatural. A few suggested rare hereditary disorders, pointing vaguely to cases in foreign medical texts. Others dismissed it as superstition, warning that rural tales were often exaggerated by fear. Still others admitted their confusion outright, reluctant to risk their reputations with conclusions they could not defend. The more examinations that took place, the more the mystery deepened, for no explanation satisfied both the eye and the page. Science, though expanding in scope after the war, still met its limits on the wooden floor of the Caldwell farmhouse. Each physician left with the same uncertainty as the last, though none could deny that the boy inspired questions they could not answer. For the family, these visits brought disruption rather than clarity. Strangers entered their home, watched their child with clinical detachment and departed, leaving Mary with a sense of exposure she could not shake. Timothy endured it with a farmer's stubborn patience, hoping one of them might eventually explain the boy's difference, but he too began to sense that no answers would come. The boy remained unchanged, living as he always had, quiet and observant, while men with notebooks and quills tried to reduce him to lines on a page. In the end, what these scientific attempts revealed was not an explanation but a boundary, the edge of what medicine could reach in 1867. Beyond that line, the boy remained a mystery, one that unsettled both his neighbors and the very men who claimed to study the human body. Inside the Caldwell farmhouse, the mystery of the boy became less about science and more about survival. Mary bore the heaviest burden, her days stretched between tending to the household and guarding her son from the whispers that followed him. Each visit from a doctor left her shaken, the boy treated like an object to be measured rather than a child to be loved. She prayed longer at night, sometimes by candlelight, sometimes silently as she worked, searching for reassurance that her son was not a curse upon her family. Timothy, in contrast, faced the world with a farmer's stern defiance. He argued with neighbors, snapped at questions, and reminded anyone who dared to insult his boy that a father's pride would not be trampled. Yet behind his stubbornness lay fatigue. Farming was hard enough without the weight of rumor, and Timothy knew each visit from outsiders pulled them further from the quiet life they once knew. The family's resources, too, began to thin under the pressure. Examinations often required payments or the purchase of medicines, and while Timothy managed the farm with care, every coin spent on treatments with no results stung his pride. Mary sometimes bartered with neighbors, trading eggs or cloth for herbs whispered to ease unusual conditions, though none brought change. Their eldest children, if records are correct, felt the shift as well. Their chores grew heavier as their parents focused on their brother, and at school they carried the shadow of whispers spoken behind their backs. Isolation deepened with each season. The Caldwells no longer lingered at market after selling produce, nor did they join neighbors for evening gatherings. Slowly they withdrew, creating a circle around themselves and their boy, protecting him not only from science's scrutiny but also from the cold suspicion of their own community. Through it all, the boy himself remained a quiet constant. He did not seem troubled by the distance that grew between his family and the town, nor by the tests that left his parents anxious and exhausted. He carried on as if untouched, watching with steady eyes as the household bent beneath the strain. To Mary, this calm was both comfort and mystery, for she could not tell whether it meant strength or detachment. To Timothy, it was a reminder that his son was not easily defined. Not by neighbors, not by doctors, perhaps not even by his own parents. By the close of 1867, the Caldwells were no longer simply farmers on the edge of town. They had become the keepers of a child whose difference reshaped their lives, turning ordinary days into a careful balancing act between love and fear, faith and doubt, family and community. By early 1868, the boy's story had begun to slip beyond the boundaries of his family and community, carried by the slow but steady current of printed words. Local newspapers, always eager for striking stories, seized upon the rumors and turned them into headlines that traveled across Ohio. One account described him as a boy of curious constitution, another as the child who defies ordinary nature. Details shifted with each telling. One paper claimed he could labor for hours without rest, another insisted his gaze unsettled even the bravest men, while yet another suggested he never grew ill when sickness swept through the county. None of these claims could be proven, but proof mattered less than spectacle. Readers, hungry for mystery in an age of progress, leaned toward stories that reminded them the world still held secrets science could not yet unlock. The effect on the Caldwells was profound. Strangers began arriving at the farmhouse, some with questions, some with offerings, some merely curious to see whether the boy matched the words they had read. For Mary, this intrusion cut deep. She felt as though her child had been taken from her and turned into an exhibit, a name in black ink rather than a boy of flesh and breath. Timothy met these visitors with guarded courtesy, though his patience thinned as questions grew more invasive. To the family, the printed stories felt like a mirror cracked in many directions, reflecting fragments of truth but never the whole picture. Each article added to the legend while subtracting from the reality of their lives, and with each page sold at a vendor's cart, their privacy shrank further. Yet the newspapers did more than distort, they also ensured the case would not be forgotten. Reports reached cities far beyond Ohio, where men of science debated the claims in lecture halls and private meetings. Some dismissed the accounts as exaggerated rural gossip, while others argued that even exaggeration could hint at truths worth studying. The boy's name, once known only to a circle of neighbors, now appeared in distant columns, transforming him from a local oddity into a subject of regional, even national, curiosity. What had begun as whispers by fence posts had grown into a story larger than the boy himself, carried on the printed page, feeding both wonder and fear. In the process, the Caldwells lost control of their own narrative. The boy was no longer only their son. He was becoming, piece by piece, the property of rumor, press, and history. As quickly as the Caldwell boy had risen into the public eye, so too did his story begin to fade. By the end of the 1860s, the newspapers that once printed sensational headlines turned their attention to other matters: elections, railroads, and the steady march of national progress. Columns that once mentioned the boy grew shorter, then disappeared entirely. Doctors who had traveled to the farmhouse carried their notes back to their cities, but few ever published their observations. Some may have hesitated, fearing ridicule. Others may have decided that the mystery was not worth their reputation. In the ledgers of medical societies, the boy's name appears only in fragments, often marked with words like unverified or unconfirmed. The silence that followed was as heavy as the noise that had preceded it, leaving only questions where once there had been crowded speculation. For the Caldwells, the quiet was both relief and burden. The stream of visitors slowed, and with it the intrusion into their daily lives. Yet the distance from the community remained, for suspicion lingers long after gossip fades. Timothy returned more fully to his work in the fields, but neighbors still held back, their greetings shorter, their visits rare. Mary continued to pray for understanding, though she received none, watching her son grow into a young man who seemed forever marked by what others once believed about him. The family withdrew deeper into themselves, creating a small circle of trust and care. To those outside, the boy was no longer a headline or a spectacle. He became once more a figure glimpsed at a distance, working in fields, walking down a dirt road, or sitting silently at the farmhouse window. In time, even those glimpses ceased to be remembered with clarity. New generations of children grew up with little knowledge of the story, hearing it only as a faint tale from their grandparents, the boy who was different. Records are thin, gravestones weathered, and ledgers incomplete. Whether he lived into adulthood or not remains uncertain, his later years obscured by the passage of time. The boy who once stood at the center of community gossip and medical debate slipped into the shadows of history. His name, once carried across counties in newsprint, became a whisper at best, until even that whisper began to fade. By the early 20th century, his case had become less a fact to be studied than a legend retold, part of the long tapestry of mysteries that linger at the edges of America's past. What remains of the Caldwell boy's story is less a record and more a shadow, cast across the margins of Ohio's history. Historians who return to the scattered notes and fading clippings find only fragments: a census entry, a line in a newspaper, a physician's sketch of uncertain origin. Each piece offers a glimpse but never the whole, like shards of glass from a window long broken. Some suggest that the boy may have lived an ordinary life after the curiosity faded, growing into adulthood and carrying his difference quietly until time erased him from memory. Others argue that his story may have been exaggerated from the beginning, shaped by the fears and fascinations of a small community eager to make meaning of what they could not understand. Still others believe he may have represented a medical anomaly far ahead of its time, a case that science, limited in 1867, could not yet explain. All possibilities remain open, marked with the word that hovers over this tale: verify. The legacy of the boy lies not only in what he was, but in what his story revealed about the world around him. In 1867, Ohio stood at a crossroads, a place where science was beginning to challenge old beliefs, but where folklore still shaped the way neighbors saw one another. The boy became a vessel for both. To doctors he was a puzzle that resisted their growing knowledge. To townspeople he was a sign that unsettled their faith and traditions. His story shows how quickly a child could become more symbol than person, how rumor could strip away the ordinary life of a family and replace it with myth. In this way the boy's difference mattered less than the reaction it provoked. He was the mirror in which a community saw its own uncertainties, its tension between progress and fear, faith and doubt. Today the Caldwell boy endures not as a solved case but as a reminder of mystery itself. History often records battles, laws and leaders, yet within its quieter corners lie stories like his, personal, fleeting, incomplete. They remind us that the past is not only a series of answers, but also a collection of questions we may never resolve. Whether he was a medical wonder, a misunderstood child, or simply the subject of stories that outgrew their source, his tale belongs to that long tradition of unsolved mysteries. In the fields of Ohio, the farmhouse may have long since vanished, and the voices that once whispered his name may have fallen silent, but the story remains. A boy science could not explain, a family caught in the balance of faith and reason, and a history that even in its silence refuses to let him go. The story of the Caldwell boy fades into silence, yet its questions remain. Was he a child misunderstood, a medical wonder beyond his time, or only a tale shaped by fear and memory? History leaves no clear answer, only the echo of a family caught between faith and science, rumor and truth. His name may be lost to ledgers, but his mystery endures, a reminder that not all stories can be explained. If this story moved you, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more forgotten mysteries from history's shadowed past.